The conservative culture war targets modernist and postmodernist art, against which it juxtaposes romantic or impressionist currents. The basic critique goes that the more modern forms of art are subversive because they constitute an attack against form and beauty. We see in both modern and postmodern art, for example, a kind of deliberate ugliness meant to critique the dominance of beauty standards in society. Against the conservative charge that postmodernist art is an engine of social corrosion, defenders of that current of art will countercharge the conservatives of wanting art that is thoughtless, easily consumed, and uncritical or counter-revolutionary. These two points of view seem irreconcilable. Either art is meant to mirror being, or it is meant to critique consequent notions of permanency and certainty. But I think it is possible to move beyond these views. In Julius Evola's Ride the Tiger, he explains that many of the dissolutive trends of modern culture could be a positive point of reference for a specific type, a person who wishes to go beyond mundane limitations. For example, Evola sees in jazz almost the absolute culmination of the Dionysian mentality, the bohemian balking of the restrictive conventions on rhythm and tone, a kind of dislimitedness and disinhibition reflected in the styles of dance that typically accompany jazz music. In jazz, he notes that there can be found rhythms that are quite similar to those used in primitive tribal ceremonies for the evocation of spirits and elementary forces, which were part of a rite of initiation. So despite jazz embodying the accelerating decay of modernity, it nonetheless contains the seeds of a spiritual outlook on life. To find in the effluvium of modern culture and civilization the hidden seeds of spiritual possibilities is what Evola means by ride the tiger. By approaching the modern world not simply as the antithesis of the anterior traditional civilization, but rather as a lawful involution of it, we can see that the path toward harnessing its possibilities, and even toward restoring the principles of that which came before it, is found not in restraining the dissolution of culture, but rather in approaching it and appropriating it in a different way than we ordinarily encounter it. Just as Kali, the namesake of the Kali Yuga, is at once a god of death and supreme liberator, the culture of the Kali Yuga can serve as a point of departure for those who seek a restoration of traditional values. The charge that leftist critics most often make of conservative art, that it is easily consumed, turns out to actually also be true of postmodern art. By reducing the transgression of form to rebellion, they make it easy for leftists and revolutionaries to consume what they see as purely a corrosive medium with no higher object. Postmodern art, by simply asking meandering questions with no certain answers, turns the task of interpretation into its own kind of consumerism, the consumption of viewpoints for the sake of their consumption, or the sampling of interpretations as if art were a kind of charcuterie. This is one of Frederick Jameson's critiques of the postmodern in his book Postmodernism, The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. In contrast, Evola challenges us to find a higher purpose behind dissolution and transgression. The central impulse behind transgression of boundaries, he argues, is the desire to be free of bonds. The material world is one such bond, the limitations of the mind and the self, another. In this way, there is actually an accidental consonance between the aims of mysticism, the death of contingency, and postmodernism, whose transgression has typically pointed out the contingency of morality and power. The dissolution characteristic of modernity and postmodernity is an affirmation of the notion that death is a doorway to the absolute. By dealing death to form, modernism and postmodernism invites us to question what exists beyond it. In this way, the involvement that Evola himself had in Dadaism in the 1920s is understandable. He sought a way beyond the limitations of the world around him, which found expression in the abstract and formless tendency within Dadaism. In the same way, Evola saw in Nietzsche an impulse toward the transcendent, which Nietzsche himself did not quite understand. The transvaluation of values implies that there is something beyond values. Nietzsche's deliberate transgressions against social norms implies that there is something beyond them. In Evola's view, the whole modern world is grasping for something that is beyond itself, but which it cannot find due to its dismissal of traditional knowledge. But if we combine this modernist yearning with the knowledge of what came before it, it can turn from a Luciferian exercise in the deification of the self-will into a genuine appreciation for what is at the heart of the universe, that which has no other and which is beyond all forms and values. This is what Evola has defined as the central task of the West. What typically passes for quote-unquote reaction today is the conservative desire to return to the age of bourgeois values. But in this, Evola sees simply the maintenance of the same forces that led to the downfall of the traditional world. Evola's schematization of history follows what he calls the regression of the castes. There is a divine golden age ruled by priestly kings, a silver age ruled by priests, a bronze age ruled by warriors, and finally an iron age ruled by the servile classes, which manifests first in rule by the bourgeoisie, and then later in rule by the proletariat. According to Evola, conservatives are simply arguing that the latter development of the Iron Age, ruled by the proletariat, should be reverted back into the other stage of the Iron Age, which is ruled by the bourgeoisie. However, to restore tradition would require consequently to revert from rule by the bourgeoisie back to rule by warriors, from warriors to priests, and then from priests back to priest-kings. As we can see, that is a very long historical road to travel. Evola instead recommends that we push forward into the future of the cycle, to continue forward until we reach the heroic age, which restores the golden age. The consequence of Evola's view is that we must actually tolerate the lawful cultural developments that have occurred in society since the beginning of the decline of bourgeois values. We have to accept and somehow integrate the disinhibition that has gripped our culture. It is not enough to ban degenerate art, just as the Nazis did, after which they presented it pejoratively in its own degenerate art gallery, but rather we must find what is of value inside this so-called degenerate art. We must take the dissolution of forms and norms as a sign that people are seeking something inside themselves, something that is higher than themselves, and ultimately something that lies beyond the domain of the senses and of discursive rationality. The task of society, then, is to provide that to them in such a way as it can, not to punish them for their transgressions. We must figure out what the hidden desire is behind those transgressions, and then present them with what they have really been seeking this whole time: participation in a traditional order. Society will not benefit from forcing people to conform with the bourgeois morality of yesterday. At most, this will isolate half of the population and then inculcate rebelliousness. As the Muslims say, there is no compulsion in religion. The path forward consists in nurturing this transcendent impulse and then giving it a center so that it will transform from destructive into constructive. I have previously labored under the delusion that we can somehow restore traditional values by simply turning back the clock or using force to engineer the social outcomes we want. But what I wasn't cognizant of at the time was the degree to which this contradicted my understanding that any society worth its name has to be organic. A society where people conform to religious values simply out of fear, rather than a genuine inner movement toward God, is in no way actually traditional, since traditionality is specifically the ongoing connection between man and God. It would be like having the husk without having the kernel. The only way to facilitate the preservation of the kernel is to speak directly to what is inside someone, to get people to realize that all their transgression, all their rebelliousness, is only a sublimation of their desire for the absolute. What those who are impressed by postmodern interrogations must realize is that their distaste for certainty is only driven by the fact that becoming, cut off from being, has no certainties. But if we drive them to ask, what is beyond becoming, they would get closer to their true motivations, the true reason why they reject the certainty of contingencies. In fact, I am impressed by the degree to which certain postmodern writings betray a desire for self-transcendence. Take, for example, the writings of Herbert Marcuse, who argued that man should embrace the world as a reflection of his ego, and by doing so, he could rejoin it as an extension of himself. This is a perverted version of the radical effacement of the ego that happens in mysticism, in which man comes to see the world as the manifestation of the transpersonal self inside him. We can even see how in postmodernism the proposition that all points of view are valid is, in a certain way, reflective of the reality that all points of view are necessarily manifested by God's infinite possibilities, and so in a certain way are all metaphysically valid, or at least lawful. We see how in postmodernism there is a desire to escape the confines of moral certainty, and in all genuine metaphysical doctrines it is held that the absolute is beyond moral values. This is why, for example, God in Thomism cannot be held to human standards of moral conduct. The path to a world where people once again enjoy traditional morality has to start with the understanding that such morality is made by God in the first place, and the only way to that realization is to transcend the man-made morality that has overtaken our world. It is, in essence, the same as the battle Jesus Christ waged against the Pharisees, only transposed onto the Christian plane. As we can see, the path toward a traditional future does not lie in dogmatically rejecting the postmodern. Rather, it consists in finding a way to make peace with it, to get at the underlying impulses behind it as a movement. In the end, the impulse toward the destruction of form can be transformed into a respect for form, once we have established the transcendent formlessness behind all manifestation and form. To be sure, many postmodernists would initially reject this as an exercise in the return of certainty, or just put it into their charcuterie of viewpoints. But gradually, I think some would begin to see the light, that what they were seeking in the first place was the formless and the deathless.